Hello again, students. It's Mr. Messner coming at you with another lecture. This time we're getting into the civil rights movement. Hope you're doing well at home. Miss you guys. You know, it is what it is, but at least the sun is shining today, right? So I don't know if it will be when you're watching this video, but if it's raining, it's a good time to be in and to get some good American history lecture in. So here's that next installment. Today we're starting the civil rights movement. So here's my nifty slideshow that's been modified and shortened. I'm trying to just cut to the important pieces that I want to leave you with. And of course, if any of this ever piques your interest, go out on your own and research it. Research how our country has gone from sort of a different sort of system based on race into one sort of seeking equity and equal treatment for all. Quite an amazing story where we've come from in the last 400 years. A lot of this is pretty tragic nowadays looking back, but it is all a part of American history, and how good and how bad it is has made us as unique as we are to this day. And so we are continually working. So I'm dividing this lecture up into two parts. This first part is going to be what's sort of the traditional civil rights movement, which is an issue between Caucasians and African Americans, whites and blacks, and try to do my best to convey the major topics of that portion of the civil rights movement, which is really the 1950s and 1960s. And then my next lecture, which I'll post next week, is going to be more of the modern civil rights movement, because there's various groups. It could be based on race, could be based on religion or gender identity, LGBTQ rights, that feel like they haven't achieved equality. And so they are working and creating a movement and continuing a movement where the historical civil rights movement ended. And so that's where we'll be going in the next lecture. So this one is more just the historical civil rights movement, and so we're talking 1950s, 1960s, and that coincides with some other stuff in American history. We're still in the Cold War, right, which we've already talked about. We're still fighting against the Soviet Union, although not directly. It's going to lead into the war in Vietnam. And so there's a lot of spillover into these other conflicts, other major sort of broad topics that we have talked about and will talk about in the future in this class. And so just know that this is all going on kind of at once, which is why the 50s, 60s, 70s are really reformational in reforming America and changing America, hopefully for the better. And there were a lot of crazy times, a lot of crazy things happening. If you talk to your parents, grandparents, maybe that lived through this era, maybe you've seen a lot of things in culture and media that portrays sort of the chaos of this era, which is pretty true. A lot of crazy stuff happening. So, but let's dive into the civil rights movement. And again, I'm just trying to just hit some of the major concepts. And so in American history, we come out of slavery, which you remember from the 8th grade, and ended in the Civil War, and into Reconstruction, which maybe you touched on in the 8th grade as well. But what comes out of the Reconstruction era is a lot of these southern states that were former Confederate states fighting for slavery, not wanting to give full legal rights to slaves, former slaves that are now freedmen and women in the South. And so what we see are what are called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is just a name. It's a cartoon character that emerges at the time. And so the term Jim Crow laws kind of stuck for a way to provide legal restrictions on people of color in the southern U.S., even after the Civil War. And so what we begin to see in all southern states is that public accommodations become segregated between whites and then what are termed coloreds, or people of color, as we now call them, more politically correct. Or the major minority population in the South is just blacks, African Americans. So whites and blacks, or whites and colors, is kind of Caucasians, is what we're referring to. And unfortunately, what was interesting about this time is that within government, government really didn't want to stop these southern states from creating these laws that initially are called the Black Codes and then lead into these Jim Crow laws. And even the federal government is not going to step in just because of this wariness after fighting the Civil War and continuing to battle about equal rights, equal representation, constitutional rights for people of color in the United States. And so this sort of burden of fighting the Civil War weighed on the United States and forced kind of the federal government to just say, all right, we're going to turn a blind eye to this and continue the travesty of racism and discrimination that existed, unfortunately, in this country a little over 100 years ago. Okay, and so one of the most famous court cases of this time is called Plessy versus Ferguson, which I can't talk about. Don't have time to talk about the background. Very interesting case if you want to look it up. But what the Supreme Court established is that we can have separation of the races in American society as long as everything is equal. Okay, we could have separate grocery stores as long as they both have the same groceries. Separate movie theaters as long as they're both playing the same films. Separate schools as long as both are getting adequately funded education. And what we're going to see quickly happen is, of course, schools of color, movie theaters of color, grocery stores of color are not going to be equal. And that's where emerges the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s to try to change that and get rid of all this discrimination and racism happening in America legally under Plessy versus Ferguson. So places of worship, living, work were all segregated. Okay, and so there's the history of segregation and racism that happens, we know, in the South, but also is going to happen nationwide. And so I want to just highlight some of the major things that you would see not maybe in the South, but also in the North, in the Midwest, especially, and even here in the West. And so just because we think of the civil rights movement as being a Southern thing doesn't mean that there's also not racism and discrimination elsewhere in America happening during this time as well. And so in many places, including the West, especially Oregon, had anti-miscegenation laws, meaning you could not intermarry if you were of different races. You were forced by law to marry people from your same race. And people were breaking this, of course, which was illegal in many states. Maybe it was legal to marry someone of a different race. It's pretty rare, but it wasn't stopping people from having children with mixed race couples. But for the most part, trying to force people to have relations with people of their own race. Job discrimination. I think you can imagine you could only get certain jobs based on your race. Disenfranchisement talks about not giving people of color the right to vote. Sundown towns we see mainly in the Midwest, some Western cities where their slogan was, if you're a person of color, the sun better not go down on you in this town, or else we're not going to protect you, or we're going to basically abuse you, maybe even kill you. And so you better not be here when the sun goes down. So pretty harsh and sad. But there's also restrictive covenants, or what is called redlining, where people of color, based on maybe their race or all people of color, could only live in certain city or areas of the city. For instance, Seattle historically has the Chinatown, right? Where Chinese people and eventually all of Asians could only live in this certain section of city. Now we call it the International District. Obviously, it's not around anymore. But also the Central District was the same thing. If you're African American in the city of Seattle, you had to live in the Central District. There was a strict red line where mortgage companies, banks were not offering the ability for people of color to expand outside those areas. Even the city of Kenmore had restrictive covenants where you could not sell your property to a person of color, and it literally said it in the deed or the title. Then also we start to see as the expansion of colored populations out of these areas happens, especially in Seattle, that whites and Caucasians fled the cities into suburbs, including Bothell, including many of our east side suburbs. So again, not just a southern thing, but even we're seeing racism and segregation happening in our area in some of these ways. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of hop into really the some of the other things that happened in the timeline from Civil War Reconstruction to modern day, and culminating in the traditional civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So I'm just trying to highlight some of the major steps, some of the major things that bring us to the civil rights movement and the fight for equal rights for all people. Specifically, I'm just talking about for people of color at this point in this lecture. Okay, so first on the timeline is the creation of the NAACP in 1909, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they were founded initially to attack segregation through law and show legally how these laws, Jim Crow laws, are a violation of the United States Constitution or a violation of state constitutions. And so initially the NAACP is going to focus on school segregation and showing that Plessy versus Ferguson, creating separate schools, separate racial schools based on race, was in fact creating a superior education system, which whites received superior education because they got more money, more funding, and then an inferior education system for students of color. And that's what they initially do. And it's going to be one of the first major victories in what we call the Civil Rights Movement, which we'll get to. So now we're fast forward to 1947. Jackie Robinson is going to be the first player to break the color barrier in professional sports. There's some other interesting individuals that break out into football and professional football and some other sports as well. But Jackie Robinson is the most well known because baseball was the king sport at the time, America's pastime, and so it was a big deal to have a player of color break into Major League Baseball. And so he's going to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He's going to win Rookie of the Year, National League MVP. He's going to be inducted in the Hall of Fame, the first chance he can be, and his number's been retired. So every Major League Baseball team, no player can have his number of 42 because it's been officially retired to just commemorate sort of what he did. And obviously he's going to have a lot of backlash, death threats, things thrown at him, things said at him, violence done against him and his family, or threats of violence. But he was a man of upstanding character and underwent that. And there's a good movie about him that just came out, 42, and a lot of good sources about him. But a lot of other pioneers in athletics, not just Jackie Robinson, but even women in athletics that are going to pioneer, like track and field. I want to say Wilma Randolph is her name, and be pioneers in other sports as well. So not just Jackie Robinson, but there's plenty of other interesting stories of breaking color barriers in other sports as well. Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so now we're getting to the 1950s. And so here's the court case that the NAACP brought to the Supreme Court, and they put a multitude of smaller cases together in order to sort of test this idea that separate but equal is okay. Okay, and so this court case is going to rule on school segregation, and what the NAACP does is use stats like you're seeing down in this graph that just proves that white schools, white school districts are getting way more money than black students in schools and school districts. And so they use this data to prove that separate but equal is not happening. And so what has happened with Plessy versus Ferguson is that in fact the separation is not equal, is not creating equality. And so the Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, which was pretty controversial for this controversial court case, actually ruled that Plessy versus Ferguson has to be overturned, and this idea of separating the races as long as they're equal is completely false. And so this was the first sort of legal court case that began chipping away at segregation. We're eventually going to see other public accommodations like busing become desegregated schools, desegregated, and all of society eventually desegregated. And here's another stat that the NAACP used. And so look at this inequality in 1940, the separate but equal. Here's the number of black graduates. Here's white graduates, unequal. And even after segregation is ended, kind of in 1970, we see about sort of 50% of the southern schools desegregated at this point. They're pretty much all 99% desegregated by 1984, but you see this prevailing sort of trend where black graduates are not graduating at the same rates as whites because of this history and legacy of segregation and not given adequate funding to black students, black school districts. And it's kind of something that's still prevailing to this day, and trying to create equality in our school districts throughout the country. And so, again, here you see the school desegregation. The year that Brown versus Board education decision came down, only 0.001% of schools desegregated. 10 years later, only 1% of Southern schools desegregated. By 1968, through President Johnson trying to push it, 32% of schools desegregated. So thanks to the president's push, 32%. But when Nixon got elected in 1968, he made it a major emphasis, and so it was literally not given money to schools that did not desegregate. So we see a lot of schools in the South, 91% desegregate by 1972, and now technically all schools are desegregated throughout the country, technically, but that's not always the case. So that was 1954, Brown versus Board education. The next year, 1955, is going to be the unfortunate death of a young man who's basically going to be the tipping point to start many of our civil rights leaders on this quest to achieve equality. And so what happens to a young man named Emmett Till is going to forever change American history and then be that tipping point to start this revolution, this reform movement called the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. So Emmett Till is a 14-year-old boy from Chicago in the North, and he goes into the South to visit family. He has an uncle and cousins in Mississippi, and the name of the town was Money, Mississippi. And so he goes into this Jim Crow South, right? And in the North, there's a bit more freedoms for people of color, but definitely in the South, not any freedoms really. In a segregated society, a definite way that you act and cannot act, or else there's going to be repercussions against you or your family, depending on how bad your actions violated sort of white society in the South. And so what reportedly happens is he walks into a grocery store with his cousins, and he ends up talking to this white woman. It's disputed what happens, whistles at a white woman, and so ends up basically acting inappropriately for a young black man, acting inappropriately towards an older white woman. And so that night, this woman's husband, the woman goes home, tells her husband what happens, and her husband hears it, and her brother hears it, and they get upset about this young black boy not behaving as he's supposed to. And so they go to the uncle's house in the middle of the night. It's a small town, everyone knows where everyone lives, and they grab Emmett Till from the house. And the uncle's like, well, what are you going to do with them? And they say and respond that they're going to teach him a lesson. Well, that lesson involved going to a barn and whipping and beating Emmett Till until he passes away, and then dragging his body and then throwing his body in a river where eventually his body is recovered. The two men who arrived at Emmett Till's house and asked for him to teach him a lesson ended up being put on trial for the murder of Emmett Till once his body was found. And but not surprising, is going to happen in most of the South. It was an all-white jury, and that all-white jury acquits the husband and the brother of murder of Emmett Till, which, I mean, isn't that shocking at that time in the South? But what became shocking is that the mother of Emmett Till ended up having an open casket funeral to portray what the white South is doing to people of color. And those pictures, there were pictures taken and printed in a nationwide magazine called Jet Magazine, and provoked tremendous outrage from all of Americans at how could you treat this 14-year-old boy this way, for doing what? For whistling, whether he did that or not. But the fact that he ends up dead at the hands of two white men, and there's no justice involved. They're acquitted, deemed not guilty, was a tremendous travesty, which starts to be a catalyst and a tipping point to start the civil rights movement. Okay. And because of the Fifth Amendment, these two gentlemen could not be tried twice for the same crime. They ended up admitting to killing Emmett Till a couple of months later in response to being paid several $1,000s to give their side of the story. So pretty sad and even more outrage. Okay, and so what happens is the NAACP in a city in Montgomery, Alabama, decided the murder of Emmett Till and the travesty done to justice, that this is their time to act. And so what a woman who's named Rosa Parks, with the leadership of the NAACP, decides to do is to start a bus boycott. And it's going to start by Rosa Parks being arrested. And it wasn't because she was tired. She got on the bus and she was tired. It was actually a coordinated plan in response to the death of Emmett Till. The NAACP in Montgomery is like, the time is ripe. The time is ripe to start this boycott, to say, for instance, let's start small and start with the buses. Let's desegregate the buses in the city of Montgomery so that regardless of your color, you can sit wherever you want. And actually, most of the ridership of Montgomery buses were African American. And so, of course, they're being forced to sit in the back when whites are present on the bus, and it's a major violation of constitutional rights. And so this is their opportunity to say, this is where we can start a movement. So this becomes the first major boycott initiated by blacks. It was the start of nonviolent resistance, where a boycott is you just are saying you are not going to walk, you're not going to ride, you're not going to ride on any of the city's buses until they change their policies and desegregate. And you can boycott for really any reason. Right? It doesn't have to be because there's segregation involved. You could feel like a company's mistreated you and you can boycott them. I'm not going to buy your stuff. There's ongoing boycotts against Starbucks, for instance, because of some of their policies or how they treat certain groups over others. And so they always seem to be a common target. Now everyone is hurting and business is hurting now during this virus. But so that's one way to try to get companies or governments to change their policies, is through nonviolent resistance, such as doing a boycott. But it's going to be a tremendous success because African Americans in the city are going to ride. They're going to carpool together, not ride on the buses. They're going to walk, carpool, and just not give their business to the bus company to the point where it's on the brink of going out of business. And so the bus company is like, okay, we need to change our policies, change our laws, which they do. Ends up being a tremendous victory. Who comes from it? Atlanta, Georgia, to lead this bus boycott as a young preacher who is a man named Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he comes to lead this boycott and encourage through weekly sermons and meetings that, hey, we need to be unified in this, have solidarity. We're not going to ride the buses. We need to push them. I know it's going to be some hardship walking and carpooling, but we need to do this to advocate for our rights, and it ends up being a success. And so he, from that movement, is going to be catapulted into the national spotlight as being the spokesperson and the official leader of what we call the civil rights movement. Okay. And another major event is what's called the Little Rock Nine in 1957, where 9 African American students desegregate one of the high schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they are at first allowed by the governor, Orville Faubus, to desegregate because they're trying to comply with the Brown versus Board of Education decision and desegregate their schools. But in fact, then the governor's like, oh, wait, no, it's not going to help me get reelected. So Orville Faubus then tries to block these 9 students from entering school on the first day of school with the National Guard. But the president at the time, Eisenhower's like, wait a minute, you're calling in the National Guard to block these students from a federal court decision. I can't have a state governor defying a federal court order. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to send in my army, my baby, the 101st Airborne. So literally he sends in the 101st Airborne just to guard these 9 students throughout. You see 10 pictured. One is going to drop out, so it's the Little Rock 9 instead of Little Rock 10. But they are going to go to school with armed guards of the 101st Airborne every day. And unfortunately, there's going to be about 60% of the white students are going to drop out, and half the teachers decide not to teach because of the chaos happening and the desegregation efforts. So kind of sad, the response by the white community. But luckily, these students are protected throughout the school year and continue, and they graduate. Some of them graduate that were seniors at the end of that school year. And so pretty remarkable. This is the first major white school system to desegregate in the South, and obviously there's lots of resistance and threats, and not overt acts of violence, though, thankfully. And so here's the students coming to school, and you see they're protected. Every day they would get in a car, and they'd go to all the students' houses and collect all 9 of the students, and they were followed in the front by a Jeep with a machine gun, and behind the car would be a Jeep with a machine gun, so nobody messed with them, obviously, because they didn't want to be gunned down. But you can imagine going to school under armed guard and barbed wire set up, and the front of the school is fortified with the military. Quite a crazy scene at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. But it was a major victory for the civil rights movement. And then college students want to get in on the fray in what's called the sit-in movement, which starts in 1960, in which 3 college students are like, hey, we want to do something too. Let's desegregate, not our school necessarily, not professional sports, but what could college students do? Well, they want to desegregate lunch counters in restaurants. So in Greensboro, North Carolina, 3 college students just decide to go sit in the white section of a restaurant and to try to desegregate the lunch counter there. And they just sat quietly and waited to be served. And the idea was they're nonviolent protesters, so if they're going to be attacked, they're going to curl up in a ball and take the beating. Why? Well, the media is going to come. Newspapers are going to take pictures, and they were going to report on these poor students of color sitting here just trying to get a meal, trying to enjoy the day, getting attacked by these vicious whites, these vicious Caucasians. And it ends up sort of, as people are watching this and watching video on TV, hearing the radio reports, seeing pictures of it, their conscience changes to be like, wow, racism, segregation is really bad. And so that's the stunning effect of nonviolence, is it just makes the attackers look really bad. And so the violence, they told these students that are sitting in, hey, violence is going to undermine the movement. If you defend yourself, so you just got to take it. If ketchup's being poured on you, take it. Salt and pepper poured on you, take it. If you're getting beaten up, take it and curl up in a ball. Because if they are violent and you attack back, it's going to undermine sort of this feeling to change the convictions and the feelings towards discrimination of Americans. Okay, and so eventually it's going to go from these 3 students and going to go nationwide, especially in the South, and eventually all these restaurants and lunch counters are going to be desegregated. And these students are going to help create a student nonviolent coordinating committee. These students committed to nonviolence, specifically college students, but then high school students as well. And it's going to be an ongoing movement throughout the 1960s to continue to end segregation in a lot of different areas and arenas. Okay, so here's some pictures of students having stuff poured on them. And it wasn't just colored students, people of color that participated. Also, white college students are going to participate. But they're going to be attacked in the same way, because it looks like that they are aiding the cause of people of color and trying to upend the system of the South, the Jim Crow South, and so not treated very well. Here's the original 3 students sitting in that Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then here's just another picture in response. You know, it's a lot of young white men that are challenging these people that are trying to desegregate, unfortunately. Okay, and so that the movement expands by college students not to just desegregate restaurants and lunch counters, but also to desegregate buses. So in 1961, in the summer, groups of college students with this new organization, SNCC, decided that they wanted to continue to enforce the desegregation of buses, not just in Montgomery, in the city there, but also interstate amongst buses that are going between states. And so technically, buses were supposed to be desegregated, but once you got to the South, you were supposed to go to your segregated areas based on your color. You know, whites in the front and people of color in the back. And so what these college students did is got on the bus and they refused to move once they crossed into the South, going from northern cities to southern cities. They refused to get up. And so these bus riders and bombs and buses were met with bombs on a couple of occasions. You see with violence, this is John Lewis, one of the civil rights leaders you could be, and another college student friend who was fighting for the same thing. He's pulling out teeth that were busted out. You see John Lewis has blood on his shoulder. So there's violence, there's bombings, and a lot of arrests by these freedom riders leaving in the north and coming in the south. And you see what happens to them as they enter. There's arrested, jailed, other violence that this map doesn't include as well. But okay, and that continues down in our timeline. We're going to a pivotal march that happens in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, in May 1963. Martin Luther King shows up to the city and is like, let's go to the worst, most segregated city in the South, and that was Birmingham. Why were they so segregated? Well, they had a chief of police who was trying to keep the rule of segregation enforced at all costs. His name was Bull Connor. He was the chief of police. And he had police dogs, and he even had a tank that the city owned that he used to try to enforce segregation. So Martin Luther King was like, let's go to Birmingham and desegregate the city and do marches every day so that the city desegregates and stops Bull Connor from using violence against black citizens. And so once Martin Luther King shows up and said, let's lead these marches, the residents and people of Birmingham were like, no way. We don't want to lose our lives. We don't want to lose our jobs. Obviously, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable situation using nonviolent tactics. And so the adults of Birmingham did not listen to Martin Luther King, but who ended up listening? Actually, the children attending school were hearing what Martin Luther King was saying. And it was being sent out via radio. Hey, let's go march. And so adults didn't show up, but who ended up showing up? Children did. And they started leaving school. And so schools, black schools, were emptying by the hundreds of students that are just flooding into the downtown areas of Birmingham saying, we are here, we're marching, we're demanding our rights. And unfortunately, Bull Connor is not using his brutal tactics against adults, but he decides, hey, even against the young people, high school students, I'm going to fire hose you. You need to leave. We are not changing our ways. And they're being marched to the jail. And every night at jail, all these students are rounded up, and then their parents come and pick them up every night. But the very next day, children would go to school, and then leave school and continue to march downtown. And so every day, these students are met with some form of violence. Eventually, dogs are used against children. That tank is rolled out. It doesn't fire upon the children, but is literally caused to separate the people. And so as America is seeing this on the nightly news or reading in the newspaper, seeing pictures of how children of color are being treated in Birmingham, there's a tremendous outrage nationwide that we could be treating the young people of our country in this way, much like we would nowadays. And so JFK, our president at the time, he wasn't super excited about passing what's going to be called the Civil Rights Act because he didn't want to desegregate everything, because he needed the Southern white vote as a Democrat to win the presidency. And so as he's going to run for re-election in 1964, he didn't want to pass this major desegregation piece of legislation and then not get the Southern vote, maybe not win the election, which is kind of ironic, but he's eventually going to be forced to create the Civil Rights Act because he's tired of seeing children, and he's getting that outrageous calls from Americans outraged at what they're seeing in Birmingham. And so he ends up in November 1963. JFK is going to be assassinated, but as one of the first acts of his legacy to cement Kennedy's legacy, his vice president, who becomes president after Kennedy is assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is going to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which ends public segregation everywhere. So grocery stores, movie theaters, schools, any public accommodations where people are supposed to be gathering cannot be segregated by race. So that happens as a legacy to JFK. Okay, but while King, and he is there in Birmingham, once he arrives and he tries to organize adults, well, Bull Connor throws him into jail. And that's when Martin Luther King writes his famous letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963 talking about what his goals are, what he's trying to accomplish in the marches, because he had many critics. Even blacks were telling him to stop and telling him that he's giving the wrong message. We need to defend ourselves. We need to raise up arms and shoot down police officers or whites that are bringing violence against us, including Malcolm X, who we'll talk about here in a second. So he had lots of critics, and while he's in jail, he got the daily newspaper and he had a pencil and he wrote in the margins of that newspaper this letter that maybe some of you have read in your AP classes, or you're welcome to read, or probably will read in college, about Martin Luther King. It's one of his most pivotal writings and messages that he ever gives. Is this letter from a Birmingham jail, and I encourage you to read it if you haven't, or you don't think you will. But it's his message to the masses, and he justifies why he's using nonviolent resistance. And he has some famous quotes. I picked out a couple. There's a lot more that I had written, but I pared it down. He says, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. As well, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Okay, so there's quite an injustice happening in the South. We need to change it because it's a threat to justice everywhere. And one of MLK's biggest critics is a contemporary of his, a man named Malcolm X. His original name is Malcolm Little, who ends up going to jail for various crimes, including theft. But while he's in jail, he hears about this prophet in America whose name is Elijah Muhammad, who is a Muslim and is advocating for blacks in America to join together in what's called the Nation of Islam under his leadership. So accept the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and then the teachings of this prophet Elijah Muhammad. And so he ends up converting to Islam, and he changes his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X, the X to represent all of his black brothers and sisters who did not have the advantage of having a name or knowing what their last name is. And so he said Little was the name given to his family as a slave, and so he was not going to take on the name of a slaveholder that gave that to his ancestors. So he's an African-American Muslim minister within the Nation of Islam, again, which is the sect of black Muslims in the United States. It's not all black Muslims in the United States, but it's just a small group. But they are going to teach, and what Malcolm X is going to teach is that we want the races to still be separate, so separation between whites and African Americans, but we don't want just that separation. We want to uplift the black community and educate blacks and support blacks and defend blacks from anyone trying to do violence or do wrong, or sort of the legal restrictions that whites are bringing. He eventually, in 1963, gets assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam, by the own sect that he was helping out and kind of leading at one point, because he was speaking out against the leader Elijah Muhammad, who was having several wives and getting rich off of people's donations and the work that Malcolm X was doing. So very good movie and book written by Alex Haley, done by Alex Haley, and Denzel Washington plays Malcolm X in that movie if you're interested in watching that. So he was a major critic of Martin Luther King, who said nonviolence is not working. This change is too slow if there are changes happening at all. So we need to defend ourselves. Okay, and so one of his demands for Malcolm X was, hey, Congress, hey, government, you need to give us the ballot, give us the right to vote, or you're going to get the bullet. It's called the ballot or bullet. Another, probably one of Malcolm X's most famous speeches that he gives. So continuing on in the movement, Martin Luther King and other major civil rights leaders, you're not seeing Malcolm X here because he doesn't agree with the ultimate goals of what the nonviolence movement is trying to achieve, but the March on Washington is going to happen in August 1963. It's going to be a national rally about jobs, trying to create jobs for people of color in the United States and trying to advance the goal of the movement. Again, by this point, they haven't desegregated all public accommodations, so trying to leverage the national government to desegregate all areas of American society. This becomes the high point of the movement, and most often remembered for Martin Luther King, given his most famous speech of all, his I Have a Dream speech, which I would encourage you to watch, which I usually would, but since we're not in class, I don't have time for it. And here's the spot on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which 100 years prior to this date, this is when Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 happening during the Civil War. 100 years later in 1963, boom, here's Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, very symbolic, given his I Have a Dream speech to end segregation, which all people of color hoped happened during the Civil War, but didn't actually happen because of the South and Jim Crow laws and the national government being weak. A lot of reasons. So there ended up being about 300,000 people around the Lincoln Memorial. This is an aerial view, and in front of the reflecting pool, the Washington Monument is further down. If you've ever been there, pretty powerful. And here's a picture, a very famous picture of his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Okay, and so what culminates with the marching in Birmingham, the March on Washington, which was both in 1963. You finally get Kennedy lukewarmly trying to support what's going to be called the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The major goal is it's going to prohibit segregation in public accommodations. So anywhere where there's public, anywhere where there's people, you cannot segregate on the basis of race. It was supposed to create the Equal Employment Commission to create and get rid of job discrimination against people of color, authorize the Justice Department to initiate lawsuits to desegregate schools and public facilities, and prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex, or gender. Okay, so that's when we start to see this wording. Anytime you apply for a job via this Civil Rights Act, every job you apply for has to have this language in it, which you've probably seen if you've applied for a job. And it's supposed to outlaw arbitrary discrimination in voter registration, which really doesn't happen, which is why we have the other big piece of legislation called the Voting Rights Act in 1965, because the Civil Rights Act, the CRA of 64, didn't go far enough in terms of helping blacks and people of color to register to vote nationwide. So Congress created a second Voting Rights Act in 1965 to end the last restrictions on voting, segregation, and discrimination. Okay, it's going to outlaw things that did exist to try to stop blacks and people of color from voting, called literacy tests. Oh, hey, you're a person of color trying to vote? Well, here's this special test that you take and only you take. If you prove that you are smart enough, then we'll let you vote. Again, of course, whites didn't have to take it. There's also a thing called poll taxes, where if you're a person of color, you had to pay extra money just to vote. Okay, now we call it ludicrous. We call it insanity to make people do that to be able to vote. But it was happening in southern states and some other states in the Union at that time as well, all the way up till 1965. And in Louisiana, for instance, they have the grandfather clause. Well, if your grandfather didn't vote, you can't vote either. Well, if your grandfather was a slave, obviously it meant he wasn't voting, so you weren't able to vote too. That was another way, unique way, that Louisiana, for instance, tried to block blacks from voting and people of color from voting. Here's sample questions from Louisiana, their literacy test. These are all difficult questions trying to confuse you. Again, you only had 10 minutes to do them. I don't have enough time to go through all of them. But for instance, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Draw a line around, okay? But not a circle, right? So it's just a line around. You can't complete that circle. Draw a line under the last word in this line. Would be that one, right? Cross out the longest word. Cross out the longest. That's the longest word in this line. Draw a line around the shortest word. It's an A, so it's kind of like a circle, but not. Now it says circle. Circle the first letter of the alphabet. Well, there's an A. Now we can finally circle it. So hopefully through these questions you're getting an idea about how outrageous they really are. Like this last one. In the space below, write the word noise backwards. So it'd be E-S-O or I-O-N. I already failed. I can't vote. Backwards, and place a dot over what would be its second letter. Should have been written forward. Well, that would be a dot over the O. But you have to write it backwards first, then put a dot over the O. Right? So just ludicrous. You only have 10 minutes. Basically, everyone's going to fail this, and that would be sort of white's justification to be like, hey, you're not smart enough to vote. Okay? You're not able to vote because you can't pass the test. Did whites have to do it? No. Would many whites be able to pass this? No. But again, it's just another way to curtail and stop people of color from being able to vote in the South. This is another one of those Jim Crow laws that gets wiped away with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So the culmination of the civil rights movement, the traditional that I've been talking about, is we get to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race. Okay, and then we get to the Voting Rights Act. You cannot stop people from voting if they're citizens of this country because of their race. So that is the ultimate sort of top sort of fight culminates with those two things happening, which is supposed to give every American, regardless of race and even gender, sort of our freedoms that we should be enjoying. Obviously, that's not always the case, which is what's going to lead into my lecture next week, which is going to be talking about how and you see how the numbers increase of voters once the Voting Rights Act takes place. You see, like in Alabama, almost 300% increase in the number of voters. Okay, so, but as we look at next week, in our lecture next week, we're going to be discussing how the movement continues past 1964 and 1965, and when other groups are like, this is our chance to achieve equality, whether it's racial groups like Native Americans or Latino Americans or Asian Americans, and it's going to expand to include women as well, LGBTQ rights or disabled rights. So it's going to expand, and so that's where our next lecture is going to be going. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture today, and thank you for grinding with me through it. Hope you guys are doing well. Miss you, and thanks for joining. Messner